So today, the title of this talk is Accessible Learning Experiences for Students with Disabilities. As Kristen mentioned, Jessica will not be able to join us. She is sick, and Anuj is out today as well. So it's just me today. But before I talked about accessible learning experiences and what goes into creating accessible learning experience, I wanted to talk some about the statistics behind disability in higher ed. In 2007, students who reported having a disability made up 11% of the general student population. There's a couple of things you need to consider when it comes to this statistic. A lot of students don't report having a disability, and a lot of students, and also the statistic does not cover students who have mental health issues. And another thing to consider is that 26% of students with disabilities attend four-year institutions. And I'm just going to go to this next slide real quick. This was Jessica's part, so I'm hoping I'm not butchering this too badly. Of students with disabilities who go in to get a degree, 21 to 34% of students with disabilities complete their bachelor's degree. And if you look at the general population, it's 58% of people complete their bachelor's degree. So there's quite a disparity there. And if we're kind of thinking about why that is, one of the things that Heather mentioned that I really liked was the idea that interfaces can discriminate. And I think that that's something that we'll touch on a little bit later here. And here's some citations for later. I can provide my slides afterwards if anyone is interested in some citations that Jessica is referencing here when it comes to disability in higher ed. And here's one of my really bad drawings. I have a couple more of them in here as well. So I want to talk about what goes into creating an accessible learning experience for students with disabilities. And there are a couple of different things. There are four main things I want to touch on today, and the fifth concept will kind of go in with all of the other four. So an accessible learning experience needs to have the same level of independence for students with disabilities. So if a student without a disability can access an experience independently, then the student with a disability needs to be able to access it independently as well. If a student without a disability is doing group work and participating in a group project and they're able to be included in that environment and do their work, the student without a disability needs to be able to do that as well. Students with disabilities need to be able to access the same information. So say you have a D2L course and you have 13 PDFs or something in your D2L course and only 3 or 4 of them are accessible, then that's clearly giving an advantage to students without disabilities. Especially even if that information is optional, then that's information that is enhancing the learning experience for students without disabilities that is not available to students with disabilities. The third idea is that students with disabilities need to be able to engage in the same interactions. The ways that we interact with systems and the ways that we interact with education and learning, it paints the way we think about things and it contextualizes learning. So students need to be able to use the same types of interactions. And also this is just something to keep in mind when you're thinking about, like back in the day, people had mobile sites versus regular sites. Some of them still do. But also, if you think about maybe 10, 15 years ago, people also used to have accessible versions of their sites and versions of their site for regular or normal people. I'm using air quotes right now. But that's just double the amount of work that someone has to put in to maintain that. Another concept is that we need to make sure that students have access to completing these educational experiences in the same time frame. So if student A can access this information at any time, like say they go on D2L at 1 a.m. because they're working until midnight, then we need to make sure that student B, who has a disability, can do the same thing, can do it independently, or can do it with their project groups, or however your class is structured. So the fifth concept that kind of goes into all of these is that the goal of an accessible learning experience is that you want to provide substantially equivalent ease of use. That's not very well defined, but I'm pulling that language from settlement agreements that happen between educational institutions and the Department of Justice or Department of Education. So the language that I used in the earlier slide reflects this slide. Accessible means that individuals with disabilities are able to independently acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, and enjoy the same services within the same time frame as individuals without disabilities with substantially equivalent ease of use. So that also brings in the usability of the systems that you're using as well. Okay, so all this is really great and the theory is really cool and all that, but it's difficult to put this into practice in higher ed where you're constantly trying to innovate and bring your educational materials to a new level and use various different media. So, you might be thinking, how do I prioritize, and how do I think about how to prioritize things? So something I'd like to talk about is there's this concept in web design. It's a principle of web design called the priority of constituencies. And what the priority of constituencies basically says is that when you're considering the impact that your designs will have on, or when you're considering how you should design things, you should consider first the user, the end user. So in this case, that's the student or the student with a disability in higher ed, most of the time. And secondly, you should consider the author. So the author would be the person delivering the course content or the person who created the course content. And thirdly, you should be considering the user agent or the browser. In this instance, we're going to think about platform. So I guess a platform for education here at MSU would be D2L. So you have to think about how the authors can use the platform to reach the end users and to reach all of them in an equal way. And then the fourth concept on this line of the priority of constituencies is theoretical purity. So as we all know, there are some great theories in higher ed and very different and amazing pedagogical approaches. But when it comes down to the practice and the applied teaching and education, we need to make sure that we are considering the platform and any limitations that it may have, the teachers, the content that they're creating through the platform and presenting through the platform, and how that is reaching the end user, the student. But the priority here, number one, is the student. So just a couple of quick heuristics, I guess. Be proactive, prepare your materials. So when you're thinking about time frame, if you have a student coming into your class who gives you a visa and they need might need to have like PDFs structured in a better way, for example. If you have to respond to that, then that is time that the students have to wait, and the students have to be their own advocates in that case, which is also kind of bizarre because students with disabilities are going to have access to less content, and they're also having to be their own advocates while attending school, which they're statistically less likely to finish, and then they're statistically less likely to get a better job of equivalent pay. Another thing to consider is preparing students for materials and the technology usage in your courses. So one thing I'd recommend is how many of you in here are instructors of some variety? If you are instructors, I would recommend letting students know the types of technologies that you're going to be using in your class, and beyond that, even being specific with the technologies. So if you're going to be using Photoshop, let students know that you're going to be using Photoshop. Firstly, that's a cost that they're going to incur, and they will need to know that information for financial aid, but also they will be able to be prepared for any accommodation that they may need when they're using these technologies. Third principle here is design material to be ubiquitously usable. So two things that go into this. Material needs to be able to be accessed robustly, so that means across a variety of devices. And it also needs to be able to be accessed at any time. If you are expecting some students to be able to, normal students to be able to access it at any time, then you should expect students with disabilities to do the same. I'm sorry, I think I keep moving the mic away from my mouth. You should design material that can be manipulated, and this goes back to universal design. You want to design things that can be used flexibly, so where the presentation can be altered by the user so that they can engage with the material however they need to engage with it. You should design to be inclusive and to include. I don't really have time to go into that. I think I'm going over. But if you must react, and if you do get a visa request and you're unprepared for this visa request, or if the student doesn't necessarily give you as much time as you would have liked, react immediately. These situations can escalate very quickly, and it's important that you use the resources that are available, like the RCPD and the team that I'm on, Digital Content Accessibility, to bring you to the point where you need to be to make sure you're providing these accessible learning experiences. Another thing I'd like to talk about is learning from your learners. You guys are all familiar with the sage on the stage analogy versus the guide on the side. Instructors' roles have kind of changed, especially in these digital environments. We're able to be facilitators more of with the students and interact with the students more individually, even in the standardized education area that we are in right now. And also, I would have drawn a bunch of other arrows here between the students, but there's those different interactions. I think the most important thing to do with this, though, is to make sure you're learning from your diverse learners. This is just a quote I have. The great aim of education is action, and I think that goes both ways. So we should expect students to act and to be able to do the things that they want to do and to be advocates, but we should also be advocates ourselves and learn from students. Here's the contact info. Yeah, I work in teaching and learning technology, by the way. I think I forgot to say that. And Jessica's the chair of the President's Advisory Committee and a bunch of other things. Yeah. All right. Thanks. Sorry.